I welcome you, dear student, today to this class on the course on United Nations and the word peace. I am Professor Iqbalur Rahman. I teach political science here in the Department of Political Science of Aligarh Muslim University. We have an understanding of what peacekeeping is. We know that peacekeeping helps countries to achieve lasting peace. We know that it supports political processes, protects hundreds of thousands of people, and helps guarantee ceasefires. It is the derivative of the idea of collective security. And when during the Cold War days, when the US and the Soviet Union rivalry was working as a hindrance in the successful working of the United Nations Security Council, this was developed as a via media to address the questions of peace and security. So it evolved itself into a very effective mechanism which is used by the United Nations in matters of threat to peace, in matters of breaches of peace, and in matters of act of aggressions. And within these three areas, a lot of activities, a lot of concerns, a lot of problems which actually fall within the meaning of particularly threat to peace, United Nations is there. United Nations gets itself involved in resolving these issues. Dear students, in peacekeeping, the three organs of the United Nations are obligated by the UN Charter to different responsibilities. The three organs are the United Nations Security Council, the United Nations General Assembly, and the United Nations Secretary General, whose role we are discussing today. United Nations Security Council creates peacekeeping operations. It defines their mandates, it scrutinizes their working, and also decides to when to close them. PKOs begin with the approval of United Nations Security Council. The next obligation is of United Nations General Assembly. General Assembly is obligated to decide about the budgeting of each PKO. When the PKO, peacekeeping operation, is created, the responsibility is transferred to the General Assembly to decide about the budget. The United Nations Secretary General is obligated to implement the peacekeeping missions, the peacekeeping operations at the ground level, at the field level. The United Nations top leadership position has broad authority to steer the agenda of organization, but its impact has varied widely since 1946. The United Nations Secretary General is appointed by the General Assembly's 193 member states and the UNSC with the concurrence of 5 permanent veto powers of the, and with the UNSC with the concurrence of 5 permanent members. The Charter describes United Nations Secretary General as equal parts diplomat and advocate, civil servant, and CEO. The Secretary General is a symbol of United Nations ideals and a spokesperson for the interest of the world's people, in particular the poor and vulnerable among them. The Secretary General serves as the Chief Administrative Officer of the United Nations under Article 98 of the United Nations Charter. His common responsibilities include making appointments to the UN post, overseeing peacekeeping missions, and mediating conflict, and all that is given to the Secretary General by the other organs of the United Nations. Each Secretary General has to struggle to balance his or her role in the situations of competing interest. Article 99 of the United Nations Charter says that the Secretary General may bring to the attention of the Security Council any matter which in his opinion may threaten the maintenance of international peace and security. The Article 99, my dear students, makes the Secretary General a political figure. This provision allows the Secretary General to choose between playing an activist role in the tradition of Dag Hammarskjöld, who died in a plane crash while dealing with the question of Rhodesia, Cambodia, in a tradition of Dag Hammarskjöld, or more of a bureaucratic role as was preferred by Kurt Waldheim in 1970s. The United Nations first Secretary General, what he says, what was his opinion, dear students? He described the Secretary General triggly. He called the Secretary General post as the most difficult job in this world. Some of the difficulty lies in the job description itself. The US President Franklin Roosevelt, several years before the creation of the United Nations, envisioned the Secretary General's role as that of a world moderator. So in his opinion, what he was envisioning was that the Secretary General has to have a role of a moderator, which is a diplomatic role, which is, if detailed, would spell out that the Secretary General has to play a political role. All Secretaries General have confronted, dear students, they all have confronted. What appears to be constant is the ambiguous nature of position itself, a role bifurcated between the task of secretary and a journal, almost always more of a former than the latter. What I'm saying? And almost always more of the former than the latter. Beyond the role of the Chief Administrative Officer, the Charter of the United Nations leaves the Secretary General's desired qualities or to his or her persona. This depends that what course the Secretary General would prefer for himself. The Charter leaves the space open for him that whether he would or she would prefer the role of a secretary or the role of a journal. Charter does not prohibit him not to undertake the role of an activist. The Secretary General is required to uphold the values of the United Nations, dear students, even at the risk of challenging member states. At a platform where there are conflicting interests, the role of the Secretary General becomes very extensive, that how to coordinate, how to cooperate among the different conflicting interests which member states express in the United Nations. For example, when tensions escalated between Serbs and the ethnic Albanians in Kosovo in 1999, the then Secretary General Kofi Annan said that no government has the right to hide behind national sovereignty in order to violate human rights. Kofi Annan is regarded as one of the very proactive, activist Secretary General of the United Nations. His contribution in matters of reform, in matters of undertaking different actions to strengthen the United Nations, to make it a viable system, quite good, quite commendable. For in the book, Secretary or Journal, the National University of Singapore, Simon Chesterman, and New York University's Thomas M. Frank write that the office holder is sometimes treated as an errand boy and punching bag, expected to be both an independent political force and a public servant. What is postulated in this book by this writer is that the Secretary General has to behave as an independent actor as well as a public servant. Human expert Stephen described the job of Secretary General as the job largely one of the persuasion, something similar which the US President Franklin D. Roosevelt has envisioned about the role of Secretary General as moderator. It can be used, as Stephen says, to rally world public opinion around issues that would not necessarily have been addressed otherwise. So, his role is not very limited. He is the person who can address the situations which otherwise would not be taken up by the United Nations on its own. So the responsibility is on the shoulder of the Secretary General, that in any situation where he locates that a situation is of seriousness and which might one day or in future turn up into a conflict, into a situation where violence would erupt, Secretary General is authorized under Article 99 to bring it to the notice of the United Nations Security Council. Dear student, the Secretary General's office oversees peacekeeping missions and appoints the Undersecretary in charge of that department, which manages a dozen operations worldwide. While the General Assembly or Security Council can initiate a peacekeeping mission, though the General Assembly has only done this once, operational control rests with the Secretariat, which is headed by none other than the Secretary General. Mediation is a very important role which is assigned with the post of Secretary General. As part of the good office's responsibility of the position, the Secretary General practices independence and impartiality to prevent and limit conflict. Examples of UN leaders taking on mediation roles in the past include Dag Hammarskjöld, who was involved in promotion of armistice between Israel and Arab states and in other situations of conflicts. The man who took on this mission, the Dag Hammarskjöld, however, had a firm belief in the United Nations' role as an international peacekeeping body and protector of the interest and integrity of less powerful nations. He was also a strong believer in the power of diplomacy. He knew that even the most intense conflict must reach a political solution, and that it was the task of international diplomacy to pave the way towards that end. Dag Hammarskjöld combined these seemingly antithetical. Dag Hammarskjöld combined these virtues remarkably well. His often quoted ambition that the United Nations should be a dynamic instrument for its member states essentially displays his pragmatic vision, as Dag Hammarskjöld understood that organization's relevance lay in its ability to constantly adapt to the new situations, to the new challenges. Peacekeeping is perhaps the most prominent example of that adoption. When the Suez crisis erupted in 1956, my dear students, the United Nations Charter did not contain any provisions for using impartial and armed UN forces to stabilize fragile situations. It still does not. There is no provision in the Charter which refers to the peacekeeping. But neither has it ever barred such arrangements. The Charter doesn't bar such kind of the arrangements. For Dag Hammarskjöld, this void was an opportunity rather than a constraint. On the basis of a suggestion from Canadian Foreign Minister Lester Pearson, he devised the concept of peacekeeping in a few days and managed to assemble the United Nations Emergency Force within weeks, which were deployed in 1956 Suez crisis. The United Nations Secretariat plays a critical role in helping the Security Council determine whether the deployment of the United Nations peacekeeping operation is the most appropriate course of action, or whether other options for the United Nations engagement should be considered. As a particular conflict develops, worsens, or approaches resolution, consultation will normally take place among member states, the Secretariat, the parties on the ground, regional actors, and potential contributing countries. One or more of the parties may even insist on a United Nations role as a precondition for signing the peace agreement. During this initial phase of consultation, the United Nations Secretary General may decide to convene a strategic assessment of the situation involving all relevant United Nations actors with the aim of identifying possible options for the United Nations involvement. The strategic assessment would strategically involved consultations with the member states, including the potential host government as well as regional and other intergovernmental organizations and other key external actors. The strategic assessment allows the United Nations planners and decision makers to conduct a system-wide analysis of the situation, identify conflict resolution and peace-building priorities, and define the appropriate framework for the United Nations engagement in the said conflicts. As soon as the security conditions permit, the Secretariat usually deploys a technical assessment mission to the country or territory where the deployment of a United Nations peace mission is envisioned. The role of the technical assessment mission is to analyze and assess the overall security, political, humanitarian, human rights and military situations on the ground and the implications of unequal United Nations peacekeeping operations. And the implications of an eventual United Nations peacekeeping operations. As such, the technical assessment mission also consists of representatives from several departments and offices. Based on the findings and recommendations of the technical assessment mission, the United Nations Secretary General normally issues a report to the Security Council recommending options for the possible establishment of the United Nations peacekeeping operations, including its size and resources. The Security Council may then pass a resolution authorizing the United Nations peacekeeping operations deployment and determining its size and mandate. The Secretary General, the Office of the Secretary General, carries a very fundamental responsibility when it comes to the implementation of peacekeeping operations. It is, if said, that the majority of the responsibility is on the shoulder of the Secretary General. He is the person who is responsible for putting the mandate given by the Security Council in effect at the ground level. This office today is engaged at large level in the peacekeeping activities. And as we discussed, that the role of Secretary General is very difficult one. Difficult one in the sense that the charter makes him a secretary and the charter also makes him a political figure, a activist. The person of the Secretary General can choose either of the role. Dag Hammarskjöld, Kofi Annan were the secretaries who actually are designated as the activist secretaries who preferred the role of a general, not the role of a secretary. Not necessarily under the mandate of the Security Council. This office, in case of Dag Hammarskjöld and Kofi Annan, was involved into peacekeeping on their own. They preferred to intervene his office, his person, to negotiate, to decide about in addressing the situations where it was thought out that it was believed that the United Nations Security Council may not get itself involved. Secretary General under Article 99 has this authority, this responsibility that he can or she can get things done. She can address the questions of peace and security through his person, through his office, through his legitimacy, which this office is associated with, through the responsibility which is on his or her shoulder, and through the moral authority which is associated with the United Nations, and the people expect that the United Nations will address the questions of peace and security. So the role of Secretary General in matters of peace occupies centrality in the United Nations, in the system of United Nations. For today, this is all. Thank you.